Can you, have I co-hosted you yet? No, I don't think I have. So you can have me invite. Oh, I'll invite, so good. Also, let's get Denver. Hey, everyone. Good to have you. Take a few minutes to invite everyone. In the meantime, there's a thread that we tweeted about 10 minutes ago, just sums up the news. If you want to go through it there before we kick off the discussion. Let me get Ian in. Well, Ian's requesting. Let me get him up. Ed is here as well. Emergent. Share, we've got the crew. And Austin's here covering for All Source. All Source is going to be late, so it's good to have you. Let me. Here. Oh.
Just so
hey,
you know,
man, how are you?
Spaces. Yeah, it's a bit unstable.
Yeah, it's been like this for a while. Usually it starts having issues when we hit big numbers, not when it's a small space. So if people are having issues with small spaces, I'm worried about this one. Ed, how are you?
I'm good. How are you guys doing?
Good, man. Good. I'm glad you're here finally taking a bullet for Brian. Usually it's Brian facing the heat.
So yeah, today, I'm here for a little bit. I don't have that much time, but I can be here for a little bit.
Yeah, in an hour, I think that I told Brian in an hour's when you guys are gonna have a blast, because so the first 30 to I'd say anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes will be about the Russia-Ukraine war. A lot of news there, a lot of developments there, and Putin's decision or law he passed, martial. It sounds like martial law. Can I call it that, Slayman, or it's too far?
No, that's a bit too far.
Okay, whatever you want to call it, we'll talk about it in a bit. And then we've got Europe, or the US sending more aid to Ukraine. I think it's €1 billion approved by Europe to support Ukraine. So that's going to be the first 30 to 60 minutes, the developments in Bakhmut and the attack that happened within Russian territory. And then we're going to be talking about the abortion law. Sulaiman will tell us more about it. And then we've got the discussion on long COVID side effects. And lastly, we've got this is your favorite, Ed. We got the Fox News. We got Murdoch admitting to, again, I don't want to say anything wrong, so we'll talk about it in a bit, but it's about the Trump election claims or stolen election claims. And then last, trade pact or treaty between EU and the US. So I think those ones will be really exciting for you. And they'll kick off in about 30 to 60 minutes, depending how long we spend on Ukraine. And we do have the crew. Oh, Jim's here as well. Sick. Emergent, bringing you up. We've got Patrick. Just sent you an invite to come up, Patrick. Let me know if you got it. And then we have, I think we've got almost everyone here. We've got a few more people joining in a bit. Austin, how are you, man?
I'm doing well. It's been a busy week, but I'm hanging in there. How about yourself?
Good, man. Good. What are your thoughts on the recent developments in Ukraine? Not just today's news, but in the last week.
So I've got a bit of a twofer, actually. So something of international news that actually kind of piqued my interest recently was I'll get to Ukraine, don't worry, was the stuff that came out of Nigeria. So late yesterday, the Nigerian Supreme Court recently struck down a bill that would invalidate all of the formerly printed Nigerian currency, the Naira, because they're looking to redesign that for security measures against sort of anti-counterfeiting.
DCs, right?
Exactly. So to start, before I dive into Bakhmut and all the crazy news out of the war, the Supreme Court sort of striking down that deal and giving Nigerians more time to convert their currency into these new bills is actually a really big bit of good news, because there were lines forming outside of major Nigerian banks and people were camping out because they were afraid that all of their savings that they were holding physically were about to be invalidated. So it's nice to see that, the judiciary branch over there has decided to kind of give people a bit more time and, prevent a bit of a localized economic crisis there. But
before you get into Ukraine, just sorry, quickly, Patrick and Angela, I see you in the audience. I've DM'd you both a request to speak. If you have it in your DMs, make sure you join from your phone. And I've also just sent you a request here on the screen to come up and speak. So check your DMs and DM me if you have any issues, and we'll help you out. So that's Angela and Patrick. Once you're on stage, so we can kick things off as we wait for more people to join. But yeah, Austin, go ahead about Ukraine. What are your thoughts on the recent developments? Because we didn't get to speak to you much yesterday. You came in a bit late.
No worries. I mean, yesterday was all internet privacy, and as much as I have my opinions on that, I would not consider myself an expert. So it was nice to hear some folks who are far more sort of technically experienced on that than I sort of speak about that. So more than happy to listen more on that in the future. I think the two big ticket items, well, I'd say there's three big ticket items, right? First and foremost, continued U.S. aid for Ukraine. This recent sort of package passed, sort of proposed by Biden and going through Congress is based upon sustainment. What we're looking at here isn't really sort of big ticket items. It's more sort of restocking ammunition, primarily in the artillery and small arms department. Which I think that's to be expected moving down the line, as long as sort of U.S. and Western support continues for Ukraine. We're going to see a lot of these sort of quote unquote smaller sort of sustainment packages going through, just so that Ukrainian artillery units have the shells that they need to continue conducting their operations. So I think that's more of a standard as opposed to an exception. Beyond that, the Bakhmut meat grinder goes on. Still a bunch of reports about heavy combat in that area as Russia.
Why does Bakhmut matter? Why does Bakhmut matter? It's just a small town. There's nothing special there. I've talked to my Ukrainian friends and my partner.
Strategically important. It's strategically important because it's used as a staging ground for launching attacks on Donbass.
Is it only that, or is it also symbolically?
It's not necessary. I wouldn't say at this point it may have become symbolically important, just for the sheer reason of how long this battle's been going on. So in regards to like resources and logistics, I would agree with you, Mario, and I would say it is just a town. But the fact that I think there's a new sort of importance being brought to Bakhmut based upon how long and how sort of grueling this battle has been. I think the objectives on the Ukrainian side have been and remain to attrite Russian forces as much as possible. And I think they've been largely successful in that. However, they're facing hardships in continuing
they've lost 10-1,
supply
Austin.
lines.
Austin, they've lost 10-1.
You're telling me that Ukrainian losses to Russian losses?
That's their own numbers. Those are their own numbers.
That's absolutely not correct.
No, that is correct.
So anyways,
I mean, you can cope as much as you want, but that is exactly what's going on. This idea that's a meat grinder for Russian forces is ridiculous when it's the other way around.
Prove it.
It's on Telegram. It's all over Ukrainian Telegram.
On Telegram. That's great.
Yes, Ukrainian Telegram. Yeah, Ukrainians on the ground are complaining about how bad it is. Meanwhile, you Austin guys.
All right, guys. Let's go one by one. So Ian, I'll let Ian. I know, Austin, you're giving us your thoughts. Maybe Ian, tell us about the point you're making, and then Austin, you could respond to it, and then we'll kick off the discussion, the news.
I mean, it's just basically what I said, right? It's been a meat grinder for Ukrainian forces. They've been throwing men into it left and right and center. Over 10,000 people, have lost their lives there, and most of them are Ukrainian. This idea that's a meat grinder for Russian forces, I disagree. I think that it definitely served as a distraction for Russian forces that were, they had to divert a lot of their energy to taking the town. Absolutely, that's true. However, when you look at the numbers, the actual numbers, and the fact that it's been a disastrous, mishap for the Ukrainian forces, which hasn't been fully supported by artillery. I mean, the idea, just the sheer idea that it's been a victory for Ukrainians, that they've been victorious in holding back the Russian forces. I mean, that's just a cope.
Austin?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is if Ukrainian forces were taking losses at a 10-1 ratio, like Ian claims, they would have abandoned Bakhmut months ago. Like that's not sustainable in the slightest. It's not even sustainable on the local level.
But we can't. But is it fair to say, guys? Is it fair to say we just can't know? We can't know the numbers because we just get different figures from different. Even on the Ukrainian side, you get different numbers. On the Russian side, you get different numbers. So it's like hard to know for sure.
What I'm driving at.
Okay.
And the Ukrainians are also contradicting themselves, right? Yeah. The Ukrainians are saying,
if I can talk.
Yeah, of course. I'll let you finish your point, Austin.
I'll let you speak.
Thanks.
Yeah. The reality of the situation in Bakhmut is that the fog of war covers exact numbers. As of right now, what we know is that they're heavy on both sides. And what we also know specifically in that salient, in that general sort of strategic area, we've seen some pretty heavy Russian vehicular losses in the Volodar salient as well, trying to drive sort of that pincer movement. That being said, what's a bit of a dire circumstance for the Ukrainians is the fact that more and more of the supply lines into Bakhmut are under sort of direct threat. They've either been cut off or they're under sort of artillery observation, which means, the Russians can call in artillery with, directors on the ground, relaying those coordinates, which makes resupply efforts more and more dangerous as it goes on. Looking forward, I mean, it's kind of unknown. It seems there's a lot of sources saying a lot of different things on what the Ukrainians aim to do. Some saying that they aim to withdraw, others saying that they aim to reinforce and sort of attack these pincers. I think we'll have a far better picture of what's actually happening in a couple of weeks. But what can be said, I think, and I think even would agree on this, is that, casualties are high. They have been high in Bakhmut. I think they'll continue to do so because it seems like both sides are kind of throwing the kitchen sink at each other there. On top of that, last item I would say on Ukraine that's worth noting is the recent attack on, I believe it's Bryansk, from this sort of Russian militia operating under the Ukrainian armed forces, moving across the border into Russia, and I think that's garnered quite a bit of.
That's going to be so that part of the agenda. I think it's new developments there as well.
Talk about that.
So Simon, maybe you can kick it off. I think we have enough people to kick off the news. Also, it's good to have you, man. We're going to start with the first story on the Ukraine war, Simon. What do we have?
Yeah, cool.
Maybe we can kick off the last point that Austin made, the attack within Russian territory.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I thought we weren't going to. Oh yeah, okay. So
yeah, CNN saying the Nazis,
the Russian militia, the neo-Nazis, they attacked Bryansk and they killed a bunch of civilians.
Yeah. So we covered this yesterday, and as Ian we covered this yesterday, but then the extra piece of news is basically what Ian said. So Ian covered it. That basically it is CNN have said that it was neo-Nazis from the Ukraine army who came and attacked. So let's start off with Ian because Ian had some thoughts.
Yeah. So, a lot of people, I don't know, maybe nobody in this room, hopefully not, are trying to paint it as some sort of military victory to attack the Russians, because obviously the Russians have been making a lot of ground inside of Ukraine, especially after the, being pushed back and losing, several key locations. However, they've been winning. So, a lot of people are on Twitter that I see with the NAFO avatars, claiming that, they've attacked Russian forces. And, you actually have to look at and analyze at what exactly they've attacked. Well, they attacked a civilian vehicle, killing the driver and injuring children. So, I mean, it's a terrorist attack. And this is how it's being painted in the Russian media. It's unclear as to what the backlash is going to look like, but I suspect it's going to look very similar to the Crimean Bridge attack.
So I want to.
Also, do you think it's fair to? Oh, sorry, Mario.
No, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. Also, so do you think it's fair to frame it as a neo-Nazi attack, and then you can answer from your perspective as well?
Yeah. No. I mean, so I think the guys who did this attack are well documented. I mean, a lot of we talked about this yesterday. These guys are Russians that have been in Ukraine since 2014. They do have neo-Nazi ideology. I think there's no denying that. Right. And so. That I agree, and this was an attack. I mean, again, I think when people, we have seen historically claims from the Russians stating, attacks that, especially right before the invasion happened in February 2022, that they claimed were Ukraine's.
Also, sorry, before you just continue, and I apologize, just for the viewers, just for some of the viewers who may not know, because you mentioned something, and I feel like not everyone will know what you're saying. When you say that they're Russians, but then they fight for Ukrainians, if you can just give a very brief understanding for the viewers and carry on.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people don't know. So there actually is, as part of Ukrainian military, that are part of the Ukrainian military, there are Russians fighting on behalf of Ukraine, right? There's a specific portion of the Ukrainian International Legion that are components that are specifically with the Russians, and how you can kind of identify them. If you look, one of the flags they wear is basically, if you look at the flag, it's white, blue, white, because the red portion, they kind of removed it because that, for them, it symbolized blood, and they identified that of the Russian flag, the red, of like the blood, of being kind of like this imperialistic Russian ideology. And so they kind of, the notion is they wipe it and they make it white, and so it's white, blue, white. So if you see that flag, that generally means Russians fighting on behalf of the Ukrainian military. And there's actually a New York Times article that published, I think it was either last week or 2 weeks ago, that actually talks about Russians fighting on behalf of Ukrainian soldiers, and they go out for the motivations they have and the procedures they do.
Yeah, we should go into the motivations. Like many of them are criminals, convicted criminals in Russia who are wanted for acts of terrorism. For instance,
but Ian, but there's Wagner that recruits actual convicts.
I think
there's a difference between Wagner recruiting actual neo-Nazis, which, from prisons, and basically they're trying to clean a slate, right? That's the difference. And obviously some of them still hold on to their ideology, but they're not fighting on behalf of that ideology, right?
So Ian, I think I can gladly have a conversation with everybody here in a different space of talking about Russian neo-Nazism and how it's permeated in Russian society. I will gladly do an entire...
I
understand. Like, let me just say this
specifically. I think people want to know about them, and I think you and Ian clarified. If we can carry on with the point.
So
we don't need to.
This whole conversation of neo-Nazism, like as if Russia doesn't have issues with neo-Nazi ideology and far-right ideology. I don't want to get into it because but Russian society has very active neo-Nazis and far-right ideology permeated within the Russian government and within the Russian military that operate. We've had multiple documentations of Russians having neo-Nazi symbology as well. This specific group that did the attack are, yes, no doubt Russian neo-Nazis that are just against Putin, but there's far-right and neo-Nazis that are also for Putin. Like, so again, like it's widespread in Russian society. And they're going to be across.
Do you mind if I also just want to jump in now? And Ian and Patrick, let me know if you disagree with this observation, because I know your stance on this issue. When Slayman sent me this piece of news, like, Mario, is it worth tweeting? I'm like, it is a fact. It may be a fact, even if it's on the Russian side. If we had Russian neo-Nazis in Ukraine kill civilians or soldiers, and they're neo-Nazis, I wouldn't tweet about it because I don't want to imply that the majority of the Ukrainian army
that assumption. I think people can make the distinction in that the Ukrainian forces a very significant, I'm not going to say large, but a significant bulk of their forces are in fact. I literally said it wasn't a majority.
So significant. What percent?
I don't know what numbers.
Well, what's significant? You say significant. Population of the people that are fighting Russia, 4% might have some neo-Nazi ideology.
There is a long-standing history, between Ukraine and Russia, in that Ukraine fought on behalf of Adolf Hitler. I mean, this is undeniable.
I'm sorry, but I got to cut you off there. Like, Mario. But again, if you look at the Soviet army, and I don't want to do this conversation because I want to finish this point that I was trying to make with Salman earlier. Ukrainians suffered, as fighting as part of the Soviet Union, suffered astronomical casualties fighting against neo-Nazi. That is a well-documented fact. Ukrainian Soviet soldiers suffered enormous casualties fighting the Nazis.
Yes, but not the Galicians. Not the Galicians. When the Soviet army walked in, they were celebrated by the Nazi. I mean, by the Ukrainians.
Yeah. Okay. But let me continue this. Let me continue this point because I think this is what. Let me just finish this point. Again, the specific attack, yes, no question about it, is well documented that the people who did this attack are Russians that have neo-Nazi ideology that conducted this attack. And I think the argument that a lot of people that are pro-Ukraine are saying, like, this kind of flag, why would they do that? Well, there's a simple reason why an attack like this is beneficial to Ukraine, right? If you think about it, it demonstrates that, as I said yesterday, right, in the space, is that Ukraine can also reach Russia. Right, that they can also conduct attacks in Russia. And I think what we're going to, and what is interesting is that within this last week, what we have seen is more consistent deep strikes into Russian territory, specifically UAVs that the Ukrainians are doing. And it makes sense. Now, from a military tactical point of view, it's not that significant, but it has a strategic, political, and propaganda value that the Ukrainians want to put pressure also on the Russians. If the Russians are launching drones and TBMs against Lviv and Kyiv, the Ukrainians have every right and desire to then do something similar against Russian targets, right, as a retaliation to show we can also affect your country. My last point, and I'll start with this with Bakhmut, right, and that's because Ian's, I think Bakhmut, the casualties on both sides has been astronomical. I mean, that is a clear and undisputable fact. But I do want to highlight something that is very important. And this is from War Mapper. So War_Mapper. He put this tweet. He's a great source. If you want the most accurate map on Ukraine, War Mapper, and I'll share it in the NAS just quickly, and if you want to remove it later. But I think so that way people can understand what I'm talking about.
I think Rybar's better.
3 days ago, he said, over the month of February, Russia increased the area of land they controlled in Ukraine by approximately 85 square kilometers. This equates to a total of around 17% of Ukraine being occupied by Russian forces, a 0.01% increase since the end of January. The Russians have started, everybody's assuming that the offensive that we're seeing right now in the Donbass specifically is this vaunted second offensive, right? But if you look at the territorial control and how it's changed, it's not. What we're seeing in Ukraine right now, and if you look at military analysts, everybody was assuming at the end of last year that the winter months was going to be a stalemate. The Russians have pushed their offensive now, but they haven't gained that much territorial control. And I wouldn't focus so much on casualties, because the problem you're running into is that both Ukraine and Russia have done mass mobilizations already for their militaries, right? They have significant manpower already. You cannot do this as a numbers game. You cannot look at it as a casualty number game. What is going to determine, because there's so many able-bodied people that both countries have that they can throw to this war.
I mean, the whole purpose, at least from the Russian perspective, right? If I may interrupt, the purpose of this, move into Bakhmut is to, it becomes a what do you call it? It becomes a numbers game, because they want to expend all their ammunition as well as their forces, right? They're able-bodied men, the combat-ready units, not so much the people who are untrained, but the combat-ready units. When the Ukrainians send them in there, they're basically expending some of their best forces fighting in Bakhmut. So, they've managed to successfully... I can
easily counter that, Ian, with this point, right? If you look at a lot of the forces that are actually in Bakhmut, yes, they have able-bodied units, but they also have territorial defense forces, which are well known not to be the most elite and trained military forces in Ukraine, right? Again, the difference that we have to see when we're analyzing the Donbass, right? What we have to analyze is the effectiveness of Russia's offensive operations. And I think Austin pointed out an example in Volodar, which has been very ineffective offensive operations that the Russians have launched against Ukraine. The issue where we're going to see really, when you want to analyze how this war is going to end, is the spring and summer. Because again, if you look at casualties, I can tell you for a fact that in Afghanistan, after 20 years, we killed a lot of Taliban, but they still were able to produce a lot of bodies. Do not make the mistake of analyzing this war now from a body count. Analyze it from an equipment and ammunition, and where it's really going to be determinative is the spring and summer, because at that point, the question then becomes, does Russia still press the offensive that they are now? And how did the Ukrainians launch their so vaunted counteroffensive with the Western equipment and training that is very extensive across Europe? There's extensive Ukrainian military getting trained, and that is why it's so important. If you focus on numbers now, I think you will fail to foresee the future in the spring and summer.
Patrick, before we move on to the next story, doesn't Russia have a history of just throwing bodies in every war they're part of? So looking at the numbers, the casualty numbers is not always a good indicator of their success or failure. Is that a fair statement? Because I've looked historically, and Russia's known, I think in every war they've lost, correct me if I'm wrong, but about 500,000 soldiers per war.
That may be true, but I don't think you can use historical analysis to determine what Russia's strategy is right now. And I'll let Patrick answer in a second. But I will say that Putin, for his part, has been extremely conservative in sending, mobilizing forces and sending them to their deaths, right? Like he has, conducted a lot of strategic retreats, and this has, actually angered a lot of the war hawks in Moscow, right? So it's a very different kind of war than what we've seen before. And I'd like Patrick to weigh in here.
Yeah, thank you. Ian is absolutely correct in that sense. And look, the way that this is being framed, and I'm not pointing fingers at anybody, but there's a lot of gaslighting going on, especially in the Western press, because, commentators can't help but be, gushing for Ukraine and running this kind of virtual simulation in the media that somehow Russia is going to be defeated next week. And, it's the beginning of the end of the beginning and all this stuff. It's not true. And it is a numbers game. It is a numbers game. And I'll tell you why. You can throw all the equipment, you can throw all the arms you want, but if you don't have the personnel to operate that equipment, if you don't have enough motivated soldiers to fight, then it's over. So it is a body count game. The other issue that many people overlook is that this is largely a political issue, this issue of the body count. This is the first war in modern history where battlefield casualties, there's a media blackout, especially in the West, but especially in Ukraine, because they don't want to hurt the recruitment drive. Zelensky, the government in Kiev, they're running press gangs because they can't get people to go to the front. And the narrative in the West is, they're putting up a brave fight. But the reality is a lot of people are being forced to fight. So it's a very different type of mobilization. And I'll tell you what, if the true numbers were to be known in the way, and I've said this before on this space and other spaces, if the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Times of London running a headline, or Le Monde in France, or worse, Der Spiegel in Germany, 120,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers, and that becomes a headline that's allowed to be printed in the Western mainstream media, ladies and gentlemen, the war's over in a week, because then the moral sensibilities of the British, of Europeans, of Americans who like to believe that somehow they have some standards in terms of morality, that kicks in, and it becomes politically untenable to back in a moral war. There'll be calls immediately for peace talks. That's the reality. So this is the most disingenuous, most corrupt media exercise of whitewashing what is an absolute meat grinder on the ground. And so we have no precedent for this. There's nothing. And the West in the mainstream media, they're always amplifying certain things. And like, for instance, the Russian Nazis. This is trivial. In terms of the context of the wider conflict, it's irrelevant.
Would you say, exactly? That's the point, Wake. So the point of Nazism in the grand scheme of things is trivial. Is that a fair statement, Patrick, for both sides?
No, not for both sides, Mario. And here's why. And you have to understand, the United States, and I challenge anybody to argue with me on this point if you wish. The United States has financially, logistically, and militarily, in terms of small arms and managing cells, has backed actual Nazi cells in Ukraine since 1948. Operation Aerodynamic, that was leaked by Cryptome in 2013. Congressional archives have this documentation now. It's publicly known. So the United States has always seen the remnants of Nazi Germany, i.e. the Ukrainian brigades and the Banderites, as the soft underbelly potentially for the Soviet Union. They have been fed, watered, and groomed since 1948. The BBC has done documentaries, especially since post-2014, the Maidan coup. Vice News, there's so many Western media outlets that documented this in the wake of the US-backed coup that destabilized the government there.
Patrick, I'm just going to let Austin let Austin quickly respond to this particular point, and then I want to go to Emergent and Angela on the next news story in the Ukraine war. So Austin, did you want to quickly respond to Patrick's points?
Yeah, what I would say is I actually think mainstream media has covered casualties quite intensively. I mean, there was an estimate by the Telegraph a little while ago about Ukrainian casualties numbering around 120,000 total. This was done in mid-February. I would disagree with the notion that Western media is shying away from casualties.
Yeah, so I'm just going to read this out. Austin, I'll read a piece quickly here to support your point. By the way, your mic is a bit of background noise. If you can get it closer, it'd be great.
And before you read it, Mario, I'd like to just jump in and say that the Kiev Independent put out a tweet earlier today, or maybe it was like yesterday, where a lot of people got pissed off at it, where they were quoting the BBC, the Mossad, and a bunch of other organizations with actual numbers of Russian casualties, and they 17,000 killed. So it's 10 to 1. Like, this idea that more Russians have died in this war, it's absolutely ludicrous.
So
Kiev Independent itself is putting it out.
I've got a piece here.
I definitely disagree with that.
Yeah, I'll read out quickly the piece as well, Austin. So we have someone that's fact checking in the background. Joa, you all know Joa, and he sent me the following. Only that's by EurasianTimes.com. And it says the following: only USA and Norway are claiming 180,000 plus Russian deaths. Most claim less than 50,000. while no one contests the Ukrainian numbers of 100,000. So obviously it's not 10 to 1, but it shows Ukrainian deaths more than the Russians, which it goes against what I
But
thought.
Mario.
We have to keep in mind.
No, but Mario, that's one report, isn't it?
So the reason to update.
All right, hold on, everyone, hold on. Yes, Sleiman, go ahead.
Can I?
Oh, sorry, Ian, and then Sleiman, go ahead, and then we'll go back to Austin. Sorry, go ahead, guys.
Yeah. So that's only one report. Like Mossad quite a while ago produced a report, and I mentioned this before, that there's been 157,000 Ukrainian deaths. There was another report, I need to verify it, apparently from CNN, that said 248,000. That one I need to verify. So the numbers, although they differ, they're in the Ukrainian side are much larger, and it may not be 10 to 1. Obviously, people are being pedantic if they want it to be exactly 10, but what Ian's trying to relay is that the numbers in Russia, in comparison,
yeah, I think Russian.
And I like to,
yeah. So Skitzer, hold on, please. Ian, I'll let you add, and then I'll let Austin finish because I did interrupt him. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Ian.
Ursula von der Leyen put out a statement a few weeks ago. This was before Bakhmut, where she said that 100,000 Ukrainian officers, not personnel, right, but officers have lost their lives, have died fighting against the Russians. 100,000 officers. Okay. So this is not counting, conscripts or anything like that. It's just officers.
All right, so Austin,
keep that number in mind.
So Austin, I'll let you finish your point there, but I do have to. Guys, I have to. I want to move on to the next news story, if you don't mind, guys. Also, I'll let you finish on this point.
Okay, first and foremost, I don't believe that Ukraine has 100,000 officers. You have to understand, basic military organization is that there are far.
Ian, if you don't.
Can I explain why they call them officers?
And
also,
Skitzer, guys, please. Let's just get Austin's point because there's more news stories. Yeah, so I'd let you finish your point, Austin, because I think we heard both sides pretty well.
Get to me.
So I think we're making a basic, when we're looking at this, we're talking these numbers, we're making a bit of a basic faux pas here, and that's talking about casualties and deaths, right? When the term casualty is used with these large numbers, it means killed in action, wounded in action, and missing in action. So folks who have gone missing or either dead, there's nothing that can really be recovered from their body to identify them. Wounded being they're off to a hospital, and then killed meaning what it sounds like. And the numbers coming from the Telegraph on that 120,000 mark that I mentioned earlier are including KIA, WIA, and MIA. So when we say, when the claim is made that only something like 30,000 Russians have died versus 120,000 Ukrainian casualties, obviously, if you include the wounded or the missing on the Russian side, that number is going to climb higher because those are different designations there. But what I'd like to finish on here is that if this claim that Ukrainian casualties to Russian casualties have been 10 Ukrainian casualties for every Russian casualty, we'd be looking at a very different war right now than we are right now. If the Russians were really enacting a 10 to 1 kill ratio, then Kyiv wouldn't have stood. Kherson would not have been retaken by the Ukrainians. They don't have the numbers for that. We wouldn't have seen Kharkiv go. I
just want to say something.
Yeah, I'll let Ian before you respond. Yeah, Ed, I will. So Ian, before you respond, I know you want to respond. So I'll let Ed and Skitzer also add their points quickly to what Austin said. We'll let Ian respond, and then I would like to go to Emergent, Angela, and Patrick for the next point. Just guys, because we've got to move on to the next news story about the Ukraine war. Go ahead, Ed.
So the New York Times reports that U.S. senior officials report that over 120 casualties have been recorded on both the Ukrainian and the Russian side.
120,000, you mean?
And 100. What did I say?
120,000. Yeah.
120,000, and they believe that Russia is closer to have had 200,000 casualties, and that was in February.
Skitzer, do you want to add a quick point before Ian gives us a final response?
Yeah, so in terms of the whole thing about the Mossad putting out updates, the Mossad doesn't even have social media accounts. And when people cite these Mossad reports, it's coming from a far-right Turkish website that's fairly obscure. And in terms of the latest figures, whether or not you believe them, that's a different story. But the UK Ministry of Defense had a great update that they posted on February 17th, with estimates being between 175 to 200,000 Russian casualties. So that's killed, wounded, etc. This likely includes 40 to 60,000 of that figure killed specifically. And then today, the head of NATO came out and stated that they believe that Russian casualties are over 200,000.
So Ian, as you
And
respond,
I put in the net.
thank you. I will check out the
last point
nets.
is
Yeah, go ahead, man.
Vola Media, which is a Russian in the Vola Media. A few remaining policies and their latest figures for Russia wounded in action being 148 to 150.
So I wanna before giving the mic to Ian, I do want to mention the next piece of news. So Ian, you can comment on that before we go to Emergent and Angela.
Sure.
And that's the Nord Stream pipeline. And actually, I'll do that in a bit. EU plans to deliver $1 billion worth of artillery shells to Ukraine within weeks. The delivery is expected to happen within weeks. This move shows the EU support to Ukraine. So we're just showing more and more money being thrown at Ukraine, and it doesn't seem to be changing. Does that just indicate a prolonged war? And while you comment on the deaths as well, Joe, just sent me the following. It's a really good point I was making as well. At the end of the day, the numbers of deaths on each side are, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but not as relevant as how quickly each side can replenish those numbers. And obviously, Russia has a massive advantage there. So I can give you a final point to touch on that. I would love your thoughts on the amount of money being thrown in this.
After this, I just want to make some, couple of points briefly.
Yeah. So and then we'll go to Emergent, Angela, and Patrick. Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, touching upon what Ursula von der Leyen said about 100,000 Ukrainian officers killed. The thing about Ukrainian military, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but basically anyone who has a college education and goes through training school is considered an officer, right? It's not the same as a military officer to become an officer. It's not like that. So essentially someone who who's on the ground, who's recruited or is a volunteer can be considered an officer as long as they have that so-called education. So that's what the 100,000 figure. This was, I believe, in January. It kind of adds up, if we look at all the other numbers, especially with what the BBC's been putting out. I'd like to go to Patrick. I think he has a lot to say about this.
If you don't mind, Patrick,
That's not how officers work at all.
No, it's not. But it's how they may be considered in terms of like the terminology. I'm not saying they're actually military officers.
But even in that sense, if you're,
I don't know why you would say that then.
So, guys, I'll go to the Emergent. I want to get your thoughts before going to Patrick in a bit because I know you haven't had a chance to speak. Emergent, I want to get your thoughts on the amount of money being thrown at this by the EU in this case, and obviously the US. It just doesn't stop. Like, how far is that sustainable in your opinion?
And just to add to Mario's questions, just to add one more point, then you can answer both. Because what the article also says is that the Ukraine have asked for 250,000 artillery shells, and so a month. So, and this goes to the idea what we talked about earlier, that basically Ukraine are running out of artillery supplies. They've basically used up a significant amount of the stockpile. They've even used in reserves, the Israeli and joint reserve, which Israel and America have. So if you can answer Mario's question.
Yeah, like that's crazy. Slimane, before Emergent speaks, that's crazy. I read as well that it's the first shortage the world has in artillery.
Wow.
Fuck, I can't say it anymore. Artillery. Shit, you know when you can't say a word, even I know. I just said it 2 seconds ago. Anyway, it's since World War I, and that's just a war between Russia and Ukraine. Does that surprise you, Emergent?
So many rounds, right? They're firing like ridiculous numbers of rounds, and the issue with Ukraine is, well, first of all, it doesn't really have a defense industry anymore. Not that it had one to begin with, and Europe has geared up, its forces for counterterrorism. Right, it should not prepare for a big war like this, right? A big conflict, and this is even considered a war technically from the Russian perspective, right? This is a special military operation, and NATO can't even keep up with it. That's
it's curious. So, Emergent artillery shortage since World War I, the first time since World War I. Does that surprise you? And what does that mean, really?
Well, and historically, artillery is in most wars, really since the 1800s, artillery is the biggest killer on the battlefield in general. I think it's interesting that this is a very big political commitment. It's a very big financial commitment. It's a very big logistical commitment to move all that material. To me, it kind of reads, kind of in the context of the discussion we were having yesterday, it reads to me as it's kind of a response to the ongoing Russian offensive, but also it seems to me like some counter posturing to counter the saber rattling from China, saying that they're going to support Russia, although they haven't been specific. So to me, this seems reads in part as counter posturing to this. I wanted to pose a question about this that I think people kind of skipped over earlier. And what I thought was interesting about the Bryansk attack and the commentary on it is that this is one of the first times throughout this conflict that we have seen the Ukrainians not officially claim credit for it, but the U.S. media say the Ukrainians are responsible. I think that's interesting. Why are we seeing that asynchronization? Because that I don't think we've seen that to this point. Anybody have any good thoughts on that? And I thought Patrick made some insights in there that there are some different yet aligned agendas between the Ukraine media and the U.S. media. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Do we know if the guy is still alive? Do we know if the guy who spearheaded the attacks is still alive, and how Russian media is treating him? Are they calling him a terrorist, or
They're calling him a terrorist?
They're calling him a terrorist. Yeah, I don't know if he's alive.
The Bryansk thing, yeah, he's alive. He did an interview a couple hours after the video with the flag next to the house.
Interview with who?
It was like Christopher Miller, I believe.
Hold on, sorry. The guy's alive, but is he in Russian custody or not?
No, he went back to Ukraine with.
Hold on. They did. He went into Russia, led the attack, and made it back to Ukraine.
Yeah, the big question I had a space with last night. We deep dived into everything that we know so far, and pretty much the timeline of events is they went in, the size, unknown. The estimates are a couple dozen people. They went to this town. Whether there was actually a fight is relatively unknown, but they did 2 short clips in front of 2 separate buildings in the town of Bryansk, where they pretty much just unfurled a flag saying that they were there, and then they left and they went back into Ukraine. And then immediately after they got back in, he had an interview with Christopher Miller, and then you had the FSB. They kept changing their narrative in terms of what happened. The FSB said that 2 people were killed and a child was wounded. Oh, first they said a child was killed. It was an 11-year-old girl. Then it changed to an 11-year-old boy. Then changed to a 10-year-old boy who wasn't killed, but was wounded with a gunshot wound to the chest of the back. And then in terms of the vehicles, when you look at the vehicles, one vehicle that a person was allegedly shot in their own video doesn't even have a single bullet hole on the car. It just has a pop tire. In between the 2 videos, the car moves from the center of the road to the side of the road.
So moving from the story, if you don't mind, and moving from because I know we covered it yesterday.
They're trying to downplay a terrorist attack because at first everybody was like, "Oh, look, the Ukrainians made it in," and then afterwards it's like, "Oh shit, they kill a civilian. I guess we can't claim that anymore."
I want to go back to the schizo. Angela, I want to get your thoughts on the amount of money being thrown at this, and do you think that is sustainable?
No, well, I don't think it's sustainable, but I think what they're doing right now is the EU, Ukraine, NATO, the whole thing. I think what they're trying to do is to get long-term financial buy-in. And so it's not sustainable to purchase this massive amount of artillery, but I do think this is related part and parcel to some of the things that you're seeing with the pipeline and, oil and gas coming out of Norway instead of Russia. I think that they're really creating financial incentives to engage in the war and to pursue these long-term relationships. And what really freaks me out about this, besides the fact that there's obviously been no plans to pursue peace talks, is there's no economic recovery plan for Russia. We're engaging in we're getting other countries to buy in with artillery. We've replaced Russian gas with Norwegian gas. My concern is the way this is looking is it's almost going to look like the Treaty of Versailles when we're done with it. So if you're not worried about nukes now, I would be very worried about what the long-term outcome could look like for Russia economically, and that would push them to the brink.
Talking about the oil pipelines and the financial incentives with the war, that kind of links to the next story.
That take, by the way.
So as you disagree with this, Ian, I want to add on to the Nord Stream developments because I think you'll all like this story. So 3 key points from the story. The Nord Stream gas pipeline, so as you know, that was ruptured a few months ago, will be sealed up and mothballed by Gazprom, I think it was. There are currently no plans to repair or reactivate the pipeline, and sources familiar with the plans have confirmed this news to Reuters. So that's the source of the story. So for anyone that doesn't know the Nord Stream, actually, maybe Slimani, you can quickly summarize both sides of the argument for the Nord Stream pipeline. Like the West says it's likely Russia. Russia says it wasn't us. People in the West are doubting whether it's Russia. There's a story come up by...
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I know. There's a whole debate there.
So
go ahead.
I'll summarize it, Mary. Yeah, so the West are saying that, guess what? There was some kind of structural damage to one of the pipelines, pipeline number 2, Nord Stream 2, and then Russia, in a panic, blew up pipeline number 1 within 16 hours. And their argument is that America would not want to hurt the feelings of their UN allies, and hence why they didn't do it. The other side of the argument is that this US wanted to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline because Russia was benefiting significantly and they were supplying the whole of Europe. And by blowing
that pipeline was not being used. So I think it's more of a bargaining chip that they could benefit from if they start using it or use it as leverage.
Pipeline
the first one was used. The first one was used.
Pipeline 1
wasn't used.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay,
that's right. Because people try and fixate on 2 and trying to ignore 1. So 1 was being used, and so they blew it up. And so after that, what's happened is the United States and Norway have started to supply Europe with the gas. So that's the story. Now, this coming out is basically saying that Russia are going to seal it up and mothball it. But because they know they're no longer going to be supplying it, they're not going to reactivate it. So, Jim, you've had your hand up for a while. If you want to give us your thoughts on that, and then any other point you wanted to make.
Well, I mean, I think there was a story I read. I don't have it immediately in front of me that I thought kind of hit a little bit of the nail on the head on this, that there is that the entire delivery system of energy to Europe has radically changed, maybe at least in the foreseeable future, permanently changed in favor of the United States as a result of the Ukraine war. I would imagine that, and it is, I have the personal opinion, that a lot of the impetus for almost coaxing Russia to do it. Not that I don't think Putin was evil for going in, because I think he was, but the whole hands under your bottom, sitting on your chair related to what Russia was doing in the buildup now is going to accrue to the benefit of United States producers. Our exports are already rising up in certain areas pretty massively, and so I tend to be of the opinion and lean towards Seymour Hersh's assertion through his investigations that Biden was behind this. I mean, they did it in a clandestine fashion. There's no easy way to confirm what happened, except if someone's willing to talk to someone like Seymour Hersh and say so. There's plausible deniability that still is out there, but let's not be fooled by this. It has been American policy to wean Europe off of Russian energy for more than a decade now, and I think that this is, I'm not a pacifist, but this is just another example of one of these wars that the United States went out to do to gain advantage for some reason or another. Largely,
it's difficult to argue. It's difficult to. I was gonna say it's difficult to argue against this point that Jim made. Like Brian, I want to go to you, get your thoughts on this. And I know Austin disagrees heavily with Jim, so it'd be good to get his thoughts afterwards. But Brian, what's your sense? Because we've never discussed the Nord Stream pipeline. You've been in our space a couple of times. I think you were in the China tension spaces. Have you looked into it? Have you read Seymour's piece, and then the other piece I've got the author's name that kind of tried to debunk it. And what's your position on this?
Well, of course, Seymour Hersh has been massively discredited since about 2002. So that's just absurd. I don't even like the guy politically.
Can I finish, or is it okay if I finish, or no, Austin?
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, no, that's Jim.
Thanks. So I'll put in the chat the articles about his bullshit. But so I go in with that perspective. Now, on the other hand, I read the article. It is sloppy because it relies entirely on anonymous sources. My bigger two reasons why I tend to not believe that I almost can't even say it honestly without laughing, tend not to believe that the United States Navy and intelligence services blew up these pipelines is, one, it's just kind of baffling to me that so many people on these chats want to blame the U.S. and the West for Russian tanks rolling into a sovereign country in Europe after the United States released declassified intelligence showing exactly what they were going to do, as though we were sitting on our hands. We weren't. We were trying to prevent them from doing what they did by exposing their plans for provocations. But secondly, and more importantly, there is absolutely no way that a United States intelligence covert action of this magnitude could be covered up. The Gang of Eight in the House and the Senate would have had to have been briefed about it. Multiple people on the intelligence committees, Republicans and Democrats, would have, and there would be proof in public by now if this had happened. So until I see some proof,
they couldn't. Brian, a quick question. Brian, I agree with your last point that it's hard to keep secrets, but it's still not impossible. I don't know what the process is, but
it's not secret anymore.
Hey, listen, I'm just going to jump in here. Listen, yes, it is possible to keep secrets. The only reason, for example, that we know about what happened.
Hold on, Patrick. You've got way too much feedback.
Okay.
Yeah, way too much background noise, Patrick. Yeah, go ahead.
The only reason we know what happened with the way that intelligence agencies are working behind the scenes with social media companies is because Elon Musk bought Twitter, or we wouldn't know that right now. So, I mean, Brian, listen, I'm not one of these people that is like so pro-Putin, pro-Russia, and then a lot of the people arguing the side that I'm with on this story are doing really bothers me, because I think Putin is evil. I think he's a horrible man, but I think we can overblow that too. But my point is that don't say that clandestine operations can't be done in a manner where there are a lot of people touching it and folks won't know what's going on. We found that out with the Twitter files. 1, 2, what Seymour Hersh laid out in his article about the operation, which, by the way, I grant he doesn't have all the information, but the reality is that all of the timeline lines up. The number of people that would be necessary in a clandestine operation to set up charges, even that could be delayed over time and triggered in the manner that was described in the article, that could be done with other people not knowing it.
Jim, quick question for you. Sorry, man, I know you got a question, but I want to ask one quick one to Jim. The argument that it was the US, my counter argument to that was, the cost of jeopardizing their relationship with Germany and NATO members is above the benefit of blowing up the pipeline and removing that bargaining chip from Russia.
Yeah,
then my counter, I've got a counter argument. So hold on, I've got a counter argument. Jim, yeah, I haven't finished, guys. I haven't finished. Ian, add on to it. I'm going to counter myself. Yeah, I'm going to counter myself. So then the way I counter my own point, Jim, and let me know what you think, is like the only way the US would do this is with the not approval, but with at least informing other countries, including Germany, and maybe doing a backdoor deal that we'll find out later in a few years when it comes out, whether through a leak or through Freedom of Information Act, is that they do a deal with Germany to make sure that Germany is not upset with it. And with NATO's approval, they blow up the pipeline to remove the bargaining chip of Russia. Is that a fair argument that they would have done with Germany or NATO members' approval?
It might make sense if there were information to contradict the fact that I'm going to lay out, which is that Russia has as much.
Before you do, can I just add this little bit here? There was a hack of the WhatsApp communications between the United States and Britain, and after the pipeline blew up, there was a message from Blinken to the then Prime Minister. I forget her name. The one who wasn't.
Theresa May is the claim.
It was not what's her name? I can't remember her name. Yeah, it was like
Theresa May, but the
Liz
claim
Truss.
the story
It was
you're
Liz
talking about
Truss.
is
Liz
Theresa
Truss.
May.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry,
it was
Liz Truss. Yeah,
Truss.
sorry.
Yeah, the message was it's done.
So
what does that mean,
well,
guys?
So and that's
So
that's
just
hard to validate.
answer Ian,
That's hard
sorry.
to validate, and it may be true. But the more important point, I think the more relevant point in this is that Russia had just as much interest in not pissing off Germany or the countries there by blowing up their own pipeline, which just seems absurd. I mean, on its face, it's absurd. Before Seymour Hersh wrote anything, that seemed absurd to me, at least. But they have just as much incentive to not mess up their relationship with Germany and the folks in Europe as the United States would. And to bolster that point, assuming there was some communications to Germany, there certainly were communications to Norway, but assuming that there were communications to Germany, we wouldn't know about that right now. And they're on board anyway with what's going on with the United States stance on this. So no.
Let's get Jim.
No,
let's get a counter. We've all. Yeah, go ahead, Simon.
Sorry, Mario.
But maybe Simon, would be good to get Austin on this just to kind of balance out the discussion.
Yeah. I just want to ask Patrick because Brian asked Brian made a point, and I think Patrick's the perfect person to answer this, based on his reporting, where he's not basically following the mainstream media narrative. Brian is, and a number of people are basically disregarding Seymour Hersh's articles by saying that he used an anonymous source. So is this a normal thing to do in reporting or investigative journalism, where you have a source and he remains anonymous and then you report the story? You can elaborate, please, Patrick.
Yes, it is a normal thing, and every single other mainstream outlet and award-winning Pulitzer Prize journalists in America use anonymous sources. So for anybody to raise that as some sort of excuse to undercut the credibility of Seymour Hersh is like patently ridiculous on its face. And if you look and they say, well, his credibility shot, I hear that talking point a lot, but like, what does that actually mean? What is the provenance of that?
I can tell you.
The last.
I'm happy to tell you.
No. Can I Can I finish, or can you let me talk,
sure,
please?
You directly challenged me, so I'd like to respond.
I haven't. You haven't even let me finish my sentence.
Yeah. So Patrick, Brian, I'll let you respond right after Patrick's done, just to respond to the challenge. Go ahead, Patrick.
Two of the last big stories that he's broke were not only true, but they potentially changed the course of policy. One of them was Abu Ghraib. Was that a lie? Did he make that up? Did he imagine that in his sleep? The other one was about East Ghouta, the red line and the rat line. That turned out to be completely true as well, although it's denied. So Seymour Hersh's record, his record is fantastic as a journalist. But what's happened here, there's a lot of people in America are, and this has been going on for years now, and
Yeah. Go ahead. So also ask your question of Brian. And then we'll go to Austin to also add on to it, and then we'll move on to the next point. Go ahead, also.
Yeah. So Brian, as part of your rebuttal, right, I would like to ask you a question to Ian's point. In your experience in the intelligence community, would the Secretary of State talk to the British Prime Minister via WhatsApp, or would they use a more secure means of communication?
No, also I want to kind of that message on WhatsApp as well. It's hard to link it directly to the Nord Stream, and it could be about something else at the same time, or it could be related and could be just negligence. But either way, Brian, I'll let you respond to that point. But more importantly, the discreditation of Seymour Hersh.
Well, a few things just on that point. First of all, the absurdity of that claim is that secretaries of state do not secretly give communications to prime ministers. Those are president to prime minister communications, and they certainly don't use WhatsApp. So that's that. On Seymour Hersh, I noticed that the prior speaker mentioned that Seymour Hersh claims that Journalists use anonymous sources all the time, but they don't typically, a responsible journalist doesn't publish, which is what it would be under U.S. law to have occurred. It would have had to have been briefed to at least 50 members and staff in Congress, Republicans and Democrats, including Kevin McCarthy. So I doubt he would be sitting on this.
But that's the point. That's Hirsch's story said they weren't briefed, that it was done. So it did.
Right,
it had,
which is
didn't have oversight. So that's the whole point. So you've just discredited your own argument.
That's another.
We'll go quickly. So guys, we'll go Austin, Brian. We'll go Austin. Final point.
Let me in on this at the end.
Okay, guys. And Jim, I do want to move on. Okay,
let's go
love you all. Austin,
said.
please. Yeah.
By all means, waiting in the wings here. Yeah, so I actually agree with a lot of what Brian's talking about, specifically in regards to the sort of legalese around covert operations, how they're handled, and who is briefed within the United States government. And for an operation like this to go forward, there would have been congressmen, many of whom would probably have incentive to talk about, Biden doing something like this to leak that, right? So I think that's a point that needs to be made.
Actually, Patrick, again, you got a lot of feedback now. Schizo, you gotta ease up, guys.
Hang on.
Austin,
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to add one more point.
Patrick,
Can I ask you a question, Austin? Austin, I want to ask you a question as well as you're responding to Patrick. I want to add the one question to this because it seems that you and Brian are discrediting the plausibility that it's the US. But the only other logical alternative, or the second option, would be Russia. So maybe you can add on to why do you think Russia did it, or do you even think it was Russia, or we just don't know, and you want to discredit that it is the US? And then right after this, right after this, I do want to go to the Austin, go ahead.
I understand the peanut gallery has a lot to say here, but what I want to get to is that. So first off, I will describe the narrative, that Russia was behind it. I personally, I don't know. I'm still waiting for more evidence to find something that I can definitively sort of put my finger on. But the narrative for Russia doing it is that Russia's narrative throughout the war in Ukraine that we've seen is that Europe would starve, Europe would freeze, right? Without the imports of Russian oil and natural gas, European homes during the winter would, have people be freezing to death. They'd have people who would be unable to cook their food, things like that. And if we've looked at infrastructure that has been used in lieu of Nord Stream, it's been mostly coming from the Gulf states. It's been coming from Norway. The United States has been exporting some, but the U.S. really doesn't have the level of export capacity, specifically on natural gas, necessary to replace Russian oil. So if you want the narrative that the Russians did it, the narrative is that the Russians wanted to create a shot across the bow to Norwegian and Scandinavian pipelines that would be supplying, these goods to the Europeans.
But they could have done it. They could have done it without destroying the pipeline, not just the pipeline was in operation.
What they're showing is they're showing.
Yeah, go ahead, Jim. Hold on, please.
They're showing capacity and ability to blow up a pipeline covertly.
That's an argument there. I've seen the argument.
Why would they need to do that? They have the ability. We know they have the ability to do it. That's submarines.
I haven't finished.
So guys. Yeah, also I'll let you wrap it up quickly. So I will go on to the next point.
This is wishcasting, guys.
I've got a lot to cover here. But the argument for the Russians that's a shot across the bow, right? Without directly attacking a NATO partner's critical infrastructure. What reality is when we're talking about Seymour Hersh and we're talking about how that article, was published and everything like that, the issue is not the use of anonymous sources. The issue is that we're talking about what's potentially an operation spanning between multiple countries, multiple agencies, and multiple militaries that's coming from a single anonymous source. Right. The use of anonymous sources is well documented, but typically you have more than one, right? I could say, I have a single anonymous source that says that Mario decided to take a mini sub down to Nord Stream 2 and blow it all up, right? But no one's going to believe that because it's coming from a single anonymous source. So I think the Hersh article is mostly nonsense. And if you dig into the specific points within it, specifically, the ship he said was used for this diving operation during Fall Ops 2022, which was a NATO operation ongoing in the area at the time. The ship he claims that was used was an Alta-class mine layer that has been laying in a scrapyard for the last 7 years.
Okay.
Go, guys. I want to go, Jim. I'll let you wrap it up. But before you do, okay. So guys,
so last point.
last point,
is
go
that
ahead.
the U.S. has very little to gain from blowing up two pipelines that hadn't been pumping gas due to legal disputes between the German government and the Russian government for months at that point, and so much risk to take for the potential of striking a fellow NATO member state critical energy infrastructure. That is the end of the alliance. If the United States blows up a German
So Sandy, I agree with that. I think this is. So I'll agree with that point. That is, I just don't find it plausible they did it without. And I know Ian disagrees on this. They did it without the approval of Germany. Ian says that Germany has very little power. It's not that important. It's a different discussion, different rabbit hole. Jim, I know you want to respond. I do want to just prep for the. I will prep for the next question, which is for Angela to kick it off, and I'll just say what the next question is. I'll read out the piece of news, and maybe Jimmy can comment on this as well. The president of Russia, Putin, signed a decree on the responsibility of enterprises for disrupting the state defense orders. So, Slayman, right after Jim responds, I want you to cover that story, and then we'll go to Angela. Go ahead, Jim. Just briefly.
Yeah. So, listen, Joe Biden is stupid, Austin. I'm sorry. I think Seymour Hersh is a radical left-winger, and there are things that I can distrust with him. But you're absolutely wrong about the article. It is not stupid and can't match up.
But Jim, don't you think Joe Biden's
Hey, Austin, let me finish. And the reality is this. It was only two countries involved, according to Seymour Hersh, what he's saying. Norway and the United States. And Joe Biden made it very clear that Nord Stream was going to be shut down. Now, we don't know from the comments that he made for sure that he meant sabotage, but he didn't make it out of the question. And the reality is that you would use precisely the ship that you're talking about to send a special team down to do whatever they're doing. And it can be hidden. Now, I don't know for a fact that it's true, but Russia always saying down Russia to destroy its own equipment. That was evident before Seymour Hersh's story came out. There are so many things about the story that match up better with what might have happened than the narrative that Russia is trying to destroy its own equipment, which I guarantee you they hope or would have hoped would be delivering natural gas into the future. So, Jim,
I just want to add one more argument that wasn't made. That could be I'm not saying I agree with that argument. That could be a false flag attack by Russia to kind of cause distrust between NATO and US. But again, it's hard.
Everything's a false flag when it comes to Russia. Civilians.
I think everything.
Listen,
I'm not saying
it's a false flag. Oh wow,
Ian,
guys. Okay, so I'm not saying it is a false flag. It's putting. It's an argument that's just saying it's an argument that's made. It's another argument made.
Stupid argument.
Guys. All right. So go ahead, Simon. I'll let you wrap it up and then just go to the next piece of news for Angela and Emergent.
Yeah, of course. Ian, I got a question for you. Why? So this is a question that doesn't make sense to me. Why would Russia blow up the Nord Stream and then not blow up the Baltic line?
Exactly, right. So what Austin is saying is that they're trying to show the world that they're capable of blowing up the Baltic line by blowing up their own line, which honestly doesn't make a lot of sense because we know they're capable of it. They have an amazingly large navy that has the ability to do this, and they have,
amazingly large navy that's on fire.
My God.
They're a great bonfire building service. You should talk about that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I'm sure Snake Island's a very valuable place.
Let's move on.
So, Slayman, I'll let you move on to the next story. Yeah. So, and that story,
Angela. So the question to you, so the story is that basically Putin has signed a decree on the responsibility of enterprises for disrupting this defense order. So basically what he's done is he's done a defense order under martial law that the enterprises will be subject to extreme control in terms of having to follow the decree, in terms of, industry. So is this a move that is based on panic, or is this a normal wartime move?
So can you explain what the move is, Slayman? Like, are they just forcing companies to? Yeah, Ian, go ahead. Support what it is, and then Angela and Emergent, I'd love your thoughts on this.
So it's like the Defense Production Act when it's the United States uses the Defense Production Act all the time. When it comes to producing weapons, every single year it uses it, right? This is not necessarily a wartime thing, but it's used often. And it was used most prominently that I think we can all remember during the pandemic when Trump, signed a decree, well, not a decree, but an executive order, basically requesting, or not requesting, but rather forcing various companies to produce PPEs, right? That was the thing that happened. And that was an emergency. However, in general use, the Department of Defense often uses the defense production order to basically rush out production of certain equipment. It can be weapons, it can be munitions, it can be parts that are used in other. If they want something quick, and so it's very similar here in Russia. Obviously, the situation right now at a moment's notice, and that's what that law is for.
Angela, I would love your thoughts and Emergent. Yeah, go ahead.
Let's go for Emergent first, because I think he might have a different view, and then we go to Angela.
So I think to me it comes across as it doesn't come across as desperation to me. It seems like Putin is trying to tighten up his ship. I wonder if he maybe has some specific goals in mind. Is he planning to target specific industries? Is he trying to go after munition production, vehicle production, aircraft production? I wonder if he's got something specific in mind there, and maybe that'd be a good topic for one of the OSN spaces later. Maybe potentially it could also be an expertise thing. He might there could be an intention not just of a technological or equipment reason, but it could be he wants to pull experts, engineers, for example, from one industry to work somewhere else. It seems like fairly typical. It's fairly typical wartime. I mean, it's not unlike what the United States did during World War II, and as Ian said earlier. But to me, it's more of an indicator of probably a response to the EU offering the amount of support that the U.S. is offering. It's Putin trying to put his country more on a wartime footing, and as we discussed yesterday with the quote special military operation, and pull out all the stops and just call this a full-blown war, which is really, for all intents and purposes, it already is. This seems like really that one of those last steps in setting that up.
Yeah, so I'd love your thoughts as well, Angela. It just doesn't seem to be that major of a development, but would love your thoughts, because you talk a lot about the war machine, and then we'll go to the next piece, because I don't think this is too important to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a normal act of war, unfortunately, and I think it's also important to keep in mind. So on the one hand, things that jump to mind is, Hitler nationalized every industry in Germany during the World Wars. That's so scary. That's true, but there are plenty of other countries, like Mexico nationalized its oil. Like we see a lot of nationalization of industries all over the world. As a libertarian, I certainly don't approve of that or agree with it, but this is someone else's country in wartime. I do think that it is probably also a response to the EU trying to help the Ukrainian government arm up, but that's also like a fairly common thing that you're going to see in war, which is allies.
Question, Rebecca. I've got a question. How powerful? Because we talk a lot about the economic war machine in the US, in the West. How no one talks about it in Russia? Do they have that same amount of influence, or all the influences within Putin and his administration?
Well, I mean, we don't talk about it in Russia, because in the United States we don't talk about Russia's strategic partners or allies, which would be, they're not excited about being friends with the Chinese Communist Party, but they've referred to the Chinese government as a strategic partner. They are allies with Iran. They're really behoove us to pay attention to that, because having
in China. So as you continue, I want to add China. EU officials say it would be an absolute red line if China provided weapons to Russia, and they'd respond with sanctions. That was an EU official. He emphasized that EU would respond with such with sanctions. Yeah, so this is
ridiculous. Like it's any of our business.
All right, so do you think
it's here, right? Angela and I are in agreement here. I think
yeah.
that Europe loves the posture. They think they're bigger than they actually are. They think they're fucking relevant. They're not relevant. They're almost entirely dependent on the Chinese economy. They're not going to do that. And if they do that, they're just screwing themselves. And they might actually do that because they're stupid enough to do it. Right? We've seen what they did to themselves with Russia, sanctioning Russian oil, and then importing the same Russian oil from Turkey and from China and Japan at a higher cost, at a premium, at 80% higher cost, which is so stupid. But this is what they're doing because I don't know what the hell the deal is. I mean,
I want to jump in here for some.
So hold on, John, Angela. Before you jump in, guys, everyone's just jumping in, please. I do want to go. I know, Patrick, you've been waiting for a while. So, Angela, I'd love you to finish your point. I'd love to get Brian. Germany is the 4th biggest economy just alone. UK is the 5th. France is the 6th. Italy is the 8th. So we got 3, 4. Mario. Yeah, but it's just more than just. You don't have to be a resource producer to be a big economy.
Buyers, they just buy stuff.
Yeah, sure, but you don't have to. But that's not. That doesn't make a resource. Doesn't have to be just a product. Doesn't have to be raw materials. It's a lot more than that. You got a lot of countries that have a lot of raw materials, but a shitty economy. But I'd go to Angela. I'd love you kind of finish your points on this.
So yeah, they have big economies, and their economies are also subsidized by United States military action. They would have to purchase their own militaries. NATO is a big part of this as well. If they didn't have the backing of the United States military might, their economies would be shaped very differently. They would have to purchase and invest in their own protection. But as it is, they don't. A lot of this stuff that we're seeing coming out of the EU, indirectly, it comes out of the United States, because they always know that Big Brother America is there to crush any enemies, and we're someone that they can sick after their enemies like a bully, and that's what's happening here in an indirect way.
Talking in absolutisms, the EU is made up of 27 member states, and the French have been conducting a military effort in the Sahel for the past 10 years. They may have not achieved their military objectives, but to simply say that the Europeans don't have any military capacity whatsoever,
like 1% of their GDP to NATO.
Enough, buddy. Like, let's hear from other people. As
Piotr, they barely give to NATO. It was a point that Trump brought up when he was in charge. He was like, you guys have to pay your dues.
Right, listen, guys. You know what it is? It's a bit rude to interrupt, isn't it? Because like a lot of people have been waiting. Patrick, you've done your master's thesis on this topic. What's your thoughts on this? And then we go to Ian and Piotr after that.
Yeah, thanks, Suleiman. The decree by Putin, this is hardly even a headline news story, because Russia has been mobilizing its national economy since the sanctions in 2014. Following the addition of Crimea to the Russian Federation, Russia buttressed its economy in so many different ways. They balanced their books, they sorted out their balance of payments, they took up a large stake in a whole range of companies. So the state basically came in and provided liquidity, and they also upped their gold reserves, and they basically set their baseline in terms of a rainy day to something like $40 to $60 per barrel for oil, because you remember the oil price crashed in 2013 at that time. So they were in dire straits with that huge raft of sanctions that came right in the aftermath of Crimea. So they've been mobilizing and buttressing their economy, preparing it for this type of crisis. So, I wouldn't be worried about the Russian economy at all compared to the European economy. The European economy has been caught completely off guard, and that is the United States has unofficially declared economic war on Europe, and especially on Germany. So they've really stuck it to Europe. They've allowed them to sort of marry this policy of embargoing one of the world's largest basket commodity producers, which is Russia. Total economic suicide, and they've all complied. They've all done it.
So I'll go.
Mario,
So
if I
before,
may,
also, I just want to add one point. Yeah, I'll let you respond.
Yeah.
I just want to add one point to what Patrick said because it covers another story. Is that Biden praised Germany for its quote profound support of Ukraine. He stated that the U.S. and Germany are moving together on Ukraine, and this is making the NATO alliance stronger. And then German Chancellor emphasized the importance of sending a message that allies will continue to support Ukraine. Also, so I'd love you to respond. Then we'll go to Piotr and Ian.
Yeah, so
Ian
I
and
want to
Piotr.
respond, and I would like to push this because I know I saw Intel raise his hand. And I think he wanted to bring us to that point. But
Yeah, sure. Intel's been waiting for a while, so maybe we'll go to Intel right after, and then we go to Ian and Piotr.
Yeah, so and Intel, I'll push this to you, but I think one of the issues about like Europeans, I mean, they do produce a lot of modern military equipment. Like, let's not forget, like they are one of the largest weapons producers in the world, and I think one of the things that we cannot forget is that the Russia-Ukrainian war has kind of reinvigorated this notion in the West that we have to start preparing for large-scale war because it's now in Europeans' door. But Intel, I know you raised your hand, you were waving, so I know you want to bring up a point about this. Go ahead.
Yeah, so in terms of the decree itself was Ian I believe was talking about comparing it to the Defense Production Act. I'd say that's fairly accurate. The decree stated that pretty much if you don't meet production demands, then your company will be gobbled up by the state and you'll become a state-owned company. And in terms of what company could this be referring to, specifically Russian tanks. They only have one tank factory. And this tank factory is only being able to pump out, since the sanctions hit them, only 20 tanks, T-90 specifically, per month. And they've been doing pretty decent with modernizing T-62s and T-72s with around 130 a month. But that's not keeping up with the demand of losses in the field, which on average has been 150 main battle tanks per month. And specifically, this company has not been able to keep up with production. All they've been able to do is take old Soviet stockpiles and modernize them. And in terms of the T-90, they're only making 20. They used to be able to make 50 per month, and now they're only making 20.
Ian and Piotr, I'll let you kind of give us your quick final thought. Emerging, go ahead.
I think he has something to say. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. We'll go to Patrick. And then Emerging, you wanted to add something as well?
Yeah, look, what he just said about Russian tanks, it's neither here nor there. It'll take Europe and America 5 years or 6, 7 years of production to catch up to Russia's current tank fleet. I don't know how many thousands of tanks they have, but I think they're tenfold above the nearest country in terms of tanks. So to think that they can't keep up with production or losses in the battlefield is a ridiculous
Patrick,
statement. I'm sorry.
Do you mind if I do a quick thing? Sorry, I don't know who unmuted. I'll skip those few, just 2 seconds to skip those. I want to kind of wrap up the Ukraine-Russia war and then move on to the next story outside of Russia-Ukraine, which is Fox, Rupert Murdoch's testimony. But before, I know. So Wagner's forces confirmed to be crossing the Bakhmut River, and it's unclear why they are crossing the river or what the intentions are. But it just seems that the Ukrainian military is.
My dude.
Okay, so I want a quick update as well on the situation in Bakhmut. We talked about it a bit earlier. Strategically, it's very important. Symbolically, as well, as very important. So, Emerging, not sure if you're following it closely there. Maybe you can touch on what Patrick and Schizo said, and then we'll go to Piotr, Austin, and Schizo.
I'd like to respond to what Intel said. I mean, yeah, I agree with both Patrick and Intel, right? So Patrick is right in that it doesn't really matter that they haven't been producing as much as they should have been or could have been. And on Intel's point, he is correct. The tank factory that they have has not been operating at capacity. They were expected to produce the T-14 Armada, which is like their next generation tank, years ago, and they failed to meet the deadlines. Failed it repeatedly. They were supposed to, release it in, I think, 2018, and they didn't. They didn't meet the demands at all. They were supposed to be producing like 50 a month. That never happened. So they're in a lot of problems. They're experiencing a lot of trouble, and obviously the Duma isn't happy with it, the military is not happy with it, and obviously Putin's not happy with it, which is why these decrees are necessary. Just to light a fire under their ass, or if anything, provide them with the logistical support that they need to start producing these next generation tanks. Because at some point, if it does come to blows with the United States or with NATO, we're not going to be seeing, the United States is not going to be fielding T-60s, right? They're going to be fielding M1 Abrams, and they need the Armada to be prepared for that.
Yeah, we'll go to just to wrap it up. Hold on, everyone. I'll get Emergent to kind of finish his points, and we'll go to Piotr and Austin, and then I want to move on to the next story. Emergent, just on, especially on the Bakhmut situation. Like, is Bakhmut, is Ukraine 2 days before the Bakhmut falls to the Russian military? Would love your thoughts there. We'll go to Austin, Piotr, and then we'll go to the next story outside of the war.
Oh, my comment I was saying to Schizo was just, I think to me the fact that Putin would go so far as to issue a broad national order suggests that there might be more than one reason. But I'd be very curious for Schizo if he has a source on the tank issue, because that's something I'd like to look further into, and that'd be a good topic for some of the other OSN spaces. But as far as the withdrawal from Bakhmut, I'd say this is a big, probably more of a symbolic loss for the Ukrainians than anything else. But and of course you're gonna see the Russians pump the propaganda on it. I actually didn't see a source link for what you had there, so there wasn't a lot of detail, Mario.
Oh, good man.
So Mario, if you want, I can because I do have to sign out, and I'll close out the Bakhmut. So. Because I just sign out, but this is the writing has been on the walls for a week now that Bakhmut was going to fall. I think that the main concern from Ukrainians is this an orderly withdrawal, or is this a kind of collapse of the front? I would suggest, and what I would say is that if Wagner managed to cross the river, because we got reports earlier today or yesterday that the Ukrainians blew up the bridges along the Bakhmut River. I think that the fact that they were able to cross it indicates that at least most of the frontline forces that Ukraine had in the center of Bakhmut, because if you look at the river, kind of dissects Ukraine in two. It dissects Bakhmut in two, and there was heavy Ukrainian presence on the western bank, on the left bank of Bakhmut. If Wagner was able to cross and they didn't receive any contact or were fired upon, that indicates to me that the Ukrainians have probably withdrawn. And they're trying to utilize that last remaining route that they had to pull out their remaining forces. What we're probably going to see, if this is true, is that Ukraine is going to set up a defensive position in the west and north of Bakhmut. There's extensive defensive positions there. The Russians have had a very hard time exploiting success, and they just don't have the speed or the capability to really exploit success once they seize terrain. So the Ukrainians will just set up a defensive position to the west, and the Russians will continue to press. And we're going to have this conversation over and over and over again until at least the summer. That's my kind of once over the world of Bakhmut.
Oh, good take.
Yeah, cool. Number one, I'd like it if we can try and avoid chaos. I'd avoid speaking in absolutisms. That's why I come in slightly hot.
You're a bit of echoey, Piotr, a bit echoey. I'm not sure if you can get closer to the mic.
Yeah, okay, sorry. So
much better.
Cool. I appreciate we can try and avoid the absolutisms. I don't think that the European situation is as simple as some have suggested. The Europeans may well, first and foremost, be a soft power. They try and emphasize things through diplomacy, rule of law, and so on. But they have proven in the past year, more than they ever have, I think, at least in recent memory, the capacity for the EU to get things done. The EU is not like any other organization in the world. It's a supranational body made up of member states, and the more power, whether you like it or not, devolved to Brussels, illustrates that the European Union, is balancing quite a lot of bureaucracy and decision making. But if they want to move quickly, they can. And whilst it's not been, prevailingly influential in the war, it has definitely yielded some impacts. And we've not seen sanctions or a resolve and unity in the European Union like this since the full-scale invasion in a year ago. So I would urge caution on saying it's completely reliant. Absolutely, there's a underfunding in defence and security more broadly in the European Union, but you could see this reflected from Joseph Borrell, who's the High Representative for Foreign Affairs. It's basically the highest diplomat in the EU, and he made a speech to the foreign embassies, ambassadors rather, in September sometime, basically saying that, for us to be more of an influential independent body, we need to be less dependent on cheap energy from Russia, big and cheap markets from China, and security assurances from America. So Europe is definitely beginning to wake the hell up. And with Schultz being in DC as we speak, the Germans, the Americans are talking about this. So I would watch that with some interest. As to the headline, which is what I wanted to speak to originally, it's not that a big a deal. I mean, a lot of these decrees, a lot of these things will be signed and co-authored as Putin. The Russian economy is in everything but name as a wartime economy. The Russian economy has been very resilient, mainly because of the amount of oil and energy supplies that it's giving to other countries, specifically India and China. And so this makes the Russian economy, despite all the sanctions. I was even reading a report this afternoon from FT about how Turkey, UAE, and I think India are the three main thoroughfares for them to be getting advanced equipment. So things like chips,
Yes,
microchips.
and
Let me go for it. Sorry,
and on this point, also before you wrap it up, I just want to ask the audience that same question. Wrapping called me. Sorry, we are wrapping up the Ukraine. Yeah, someone just called me.
Yeah.
I hate when people call me. I hate
okay.
it. Yeah. So what I was gonna say is just for the audience, because I didn't ask you a question. I'm gonna go through the comments now. I want to go back to the Nord Stream discussion because this is a very polarizing topic. A lot of people are saying we can't wait for the Nord Stream space, which we're preparing for. There's arguments to be made to pretty much implicate every country, and I just cannot come to a conclusion on who did it. I'm leaning more towards US with NATO approval, but I could change my mind at an instant. So I'm waiting for that debate. But I want to get the audience's thoughts before we move on from the Ukraine-Russia war. Who do you think is responsible for the Nord Stream pipeline and why? I want to go through the comments.
Mario, it's aliens.
Yeah, this is one of my top. I think so. I think this is my top. This is my top. On the top of the list is aliens. The second one is the lizards that control the world, and the third is Russia with NATO approval. So that's.
I mean, aliens is probably more plausible than the United States.
I'll go to.
The United States not doing it.
Do you mind if I just finish my last point
yeah,
and then I'll?
Yeah, briefly. Yeah, just very briefly. We'll go to Austin to move to the next story.
Yeah, because we covered a lot, so there's a lot I just wanted to touch on. So as
very briefly, but we're a bit over time with the Ukraine-Russia war, so that's why I'm just
okay.
trying to wrap it up.
I would just say very quickly, Bakhmut is arguably like Mariupol and Bucha in the first few months of the war. Bakhmut has become a symbol of the war. The Russians, it's not that strategic. It's purely the Russians want it because they've put so much important, focus on it. A lot of experts have said that any Russian victory could be Pyrrhic, which basically means it's not worth the cost. The Ukrainians suggest that they have lost about 7 times as many as the Ukrainians have. But I would emphasize that any intel, any information you hear on either side will be extremely questionable because
we do have breaking news, by the way. Sorry to interrupt you, Piotr. I've just been waiting on whether to share it. Rosaler's just sent it through to me. I might invite him in. Can you actually invite in Rose Alerts, please, Slayman? So I'm just going to read out the news.
Right, Mario?
Hazmat crews. Yeah, exactly. How serious is it, Ian?
I would say pretty serious. It's a chemical spill. It's also owned by Norfolk Southern. So, yeah.
Where's
Jesus Christ. That's in Ohio again.
Springfield,
Hazmat.
Ohio, yeah.
Yeah, I think we should cover this.
We should. Yeah.
Yeah, what do you think,
Simon?
I
can read the whole news. I can read the whole
news.
Please
do that, and I'll just just prepare to probably cover this.
So this is detailed by Matt Wallace. He's a good account. He shows a video, and I'll put it in the top there so you guys can watch it yourself. There's a video of it actually happening. Video with sound. Another Ohio train likely carrying toxic chemicals has derailed in Springfield, Ohio. Clark County Emergency Management Agency is asking residents to shelter in place. A hazmat crew is confirmed to be on the scene, according to News Center 7's Taylor Robertson. And the State Highway Patrol and Clark County Sheriff's Office are also on the scene. And Norfolk Southern owns this train. And so that's where we are at so far. That's
to cover this. Yeah, I'm getting a call from Nick, who's on the ground.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll give you the mic. Simon, can you take over? I'm just going to call Nick because he's on.
Less so. But I think it's just important to note that they did beat sort of expectations that their economy would contract by 12% over the last year. The Russian economy only contracted by 2%. But I think it's important to also note that most European economies in Q4 2022 grew, ranging from, so countries such as Austria, France, Belgium, Denmark, Slovakia, Portugal, Lithuania, Germany, Italy, Sweden, Bulgaria, Poland, Luxembourg, Romania, Malta, Cyprus, and then the big winner of them all was Ireland. So when we talk about European economic hardships, I think it's important to look at how those economies are adjusting and evolving and what does growth look like moving forward, for how long they can sort of sustain something like that. Second, last point I have on Ukraine before I move to this hazmat situation is in regards to the initial point about sort of like a shell shortage. I think that was kind of to be expected from any side. I don't think countries have really produced artillery shells at scale, at least in the US since Desert Storm, and other countries like Russia since, the Chechen crisis. I think that's something that's as to be expected. I think many expectations about this war were that it would be a war of maneuver, not a war of attrition. And as a result of that, we're seeing a bunch of countries lacking in their domestic stockpiles over shells themselves. And when we talk about tanks, I mean, Patrick was correct in the fact that Russia has the largest tank fleet in the world. I think what's necessary context is that a lot of those tanks were produced in the 60s and the 70s. They've just kept those Soviet stockpiles for.
Yeah, and they've lost how many thousands?
Moving on.
Like 2,000, 3,000?
Right. That's guys. If we can just bring it back to this new topic.
Hazmat, yes. Yeah. On the hazmat
please do,
situation. So I think the overarching thing to look at here when we talk about hazmat situations in the United States is that this is something that's recently grabbed sort of national attention for the amount of incidents that happen normally every year. We have multiple hazmat incidents in the United States, most of every day. Most of it typically has to do with trucks, like a tractor trailer towing something that's particularly corrosive or hazardous, being overturned and causing a hazmat situation that results in people being told to sort of stay indoors while emergency crews respond to that. I think what we're looking at is there's a far greater sort of public eye on incidents like this, specifically in regards to Norfolk Southern and seeing another train derailment. I'm not particularly surprised because if we look at some of the regulations that were taken off in the past couple of years, in order to get those regulations back on, in order to reestablish sort of senses like good, safe practices, that takes time. And I would look at sort of the East Palestine disaster as being more of a sign for more disasters down the road, as opposed to a one-off incident. Because if it can happen there, then it can happen anywhere where Norfolk Southern or other railroads are sort of conducting the same practices. And in order to mitigate risk, you need good practices and you need time to implement those practices. And I don't think we've seen